Content warning. This content may be unsuitable for viewers under 18 years of age and for those who are sensitive to fear, horror, or disturbing real-life events. If you are under 18 or sensitive to frightening content, please do not watch. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The Woman at the Glass. The light that should not have come on. It was the kind of winter night that makes you feel like the rest of the world has gone to sleep without telling you. The wind had been howling since sundown, pushing dead leaves against the side of the house in long, dragging scrapes that sounded almost too rhythmic to be natural. I was 17 years old, home alone for the first time in what felt like a real, serious way. Not the kind of alone where your parents are just down the street grabbing groceries, but the kind where you're genuinely on your own for the night and you know it. My parents were visiting relatives a few states over. They'd left that morning, and by evening I had fully settled into the comfortable rhythm of a teenager with an empty house. Chips on the coffee table, shoes kicked off at the door, television turned up louder than it ever got when they were home. The den at the back of the house was my favorite room when the weather turned cold. It was smaller than the main living room, surrounded on three sides by big windows that looked out onto the side yard and the narrow driveway that ran between our house and the wooden fence, separating us from the neighbors. We had a heavy-duty storm door on the side of that room, the kind with the full glass panel running top to bottom, and because of that, we kept thick thermal blinds on every window in there during winter, the kind that blocked out everything when they were pulled all the way down. That night, I had every single one of them pulled shut, the lamp on the side table turned to its lowest setting, and a fleece blanket wrapped around me on the couch. I was somewhere in the middle of a movie I'd already half forgotten when it happened. The floodlight on the side of the house clicked on. Now, that light was motion-activated. It had been installed the summer before, after a string of car break-ins on our block. It was powerful, the kind of light that blasted the driveway in sharp white clarity the moment anything larger than a squirrel crossed its sensor. I knew the sound it made when it clicked on. A low, electrical thunk, followed by the faint hum of the bulb warming up. I'd heard it 100 times when the neighbor's dog got loose or when a delivery driver pulled in too far. But it was past 11 o'clock at night. No deliveries, no neighbors, no reason for anything to be moving out there. I turned the volume down on the television. Silence. Just the wind against the glass. I held still for a long moment, listening with the specific focused attention that fear produces, the kind where you stop breathing without meaning to, and every small sound in the room becomes enormous. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the creak of the house settling, my own pulse starting to climb. I told myself it was probably an animal. A raccoon rooting through the recycling bins, or one of the stray cats that cut through our yard sometimes. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the most likely explanation by a wide margin. But I lifted the edge of the blinds anyway, just a sliver, just enough to see. The driveway was empty. The light was on, washing everything in cold white, and there was nothing there. No animal, no person. Nothing moved. I let the blind fall back into place and sat there for a moment with my hand still on the fabric, telling myself I was fine. I put my shoes on, I don't know exactly why, maybe some instinct that said I might need to move quickly. And I went out through the side door, walked the length of the driveway, checked around the corner of the house, and came back. Nothing. Nobody. I went back to my movie. And then, maybe 20 minutes later, something outside crashed. Not a subtle sound, not a branch in the wind. It was the heavy, hollow bang of something large being knocked over, metal or thick plastic, followed by a rolling, clattering echo that didn't fade fast enough. The recycling bin, I thought immediately. But we kept the recycling bin on the far side of the gate, away from the driveway, and I'd checked that area already. The floodlight came on again. This time I didn't convince myself it was a raccoon. I sat completely still on the couch, and I want to try to describe what happened inside me in that moment, because I think it's important. It wasn't just fear. It was a particular kind of fear that I've only felt a handful of times in my life. The kind that comes when your brain makes the quiet, terrible calculation that something is wrong, actually wrong, and that the window for doing something simple and easy about it may have already closed. The couch was positioned in the only part of the room that wasn't directly visible from the glass panel in the side door. I knew this because I used to think about it as a kid, playing little mental games about which spots in each room were safe from windows. Now I was thinking about it for real. The remote control was sitting in the middle of the coffee table, maybe 4 feet away from me. I was afraid to reach for it. I was afraid that if I moved, if I made the television go dark and silent, whatever was outside would hear the change. So I sat there, and I stared at the blinds, and that's when I saw it, the shape in the window. I want to be clear about exactly what I saw, because I've told this story before, and people sometimes assume I'm exaggerating or filling in details with imagination. I am not. What I saw was the unmistakable sharp-edged outline of a human being. The blinds were thick, the good thermal kind, but the light outside was so intense that it cast a perfect shadow through the fabric. And in that shadow, there was a figure, standing directly in front of the window, close enough to the glass that the outline had definition. Shoulders, a torso, arms held slightly away from the sides of the body in that stiff, unnatural way that people stand when they are very still and very deliberate. I could not scream. I want to tell you that I did something brave or decisive, but the truth is that for a long, terrible moment I was absolutely locked in place. I couldn't make my lungs work. The sensation in my chest was physical, like something pressing down from the inside, a pressure that made it hard to get air in. And then my body made a decision without asking my brain, and I got up from the couch. I was moving toward the interior door, the one that connects the den to the dining room, the one that puts a solid wall between you and those windows, when the person on the other side of the glass started pounding. Not knocking, pounding. Both fists hard and fast against the window glass, and the sound of it in that small room was enormous, a booming, rattling impact that shook the frame and sent a shock through my whole body. I screamed. I'm not ashamed of it. I screamed from somewhere deep and involuntary, and what came out of my mouth was, "I'm calling the cops! I'm calling the cops right now!" My voice was shaking. I could hear it shaking. But I stood in the doorway and I yelled it again, louder, and after a few seconds the pounding stopped. I watched the shadow through the blinds. It shifted. It moved. Not away, not toward the street, but sideways, toward the door. I had maybe 2 seconds to process this before the shadow resolved into something real, and the door filled with a face. She was elderly. That was the first thing I registered, and I'll admit that for one single, stupid second I felt a wave of confused relief. An old woman, not the monster my imagination had been building. She had wild, wiry white hair that caught the floodlight and seemed to glow at the edges, and she was wearing a heavy house dress that was too thin for the weather, and her expression was unlike anything I had seen on a human face before or since. Not rage, not confusion, something else, something that didn't track with any of the normal categories. She looked at me through the glass panel of the door with the complete intensity of a person who was not operating in the same reality as everyone else. And then she began to scream. The glass breaking I don't remember making the decision to call 911. I remember the sound of my own voice on the phone, still shaking, barely coherent, and the dispatcher asking me to slow down and repeat myself, and the strange, exhausting effort of trying to explain what was happening while also keeping my back against the interior wall of the hallway so I couldn't be seen from the den windows. The dispatcher told me to get to an interior room with a lock, stay away from the windows, and find something I could use to defend myself if necessary. I went to the downstairs bathroom at the end of the hall, no windows, door with a deadbolt, and I sat on the edge of the tub with my back to the wall and my phone pressed so hard against my ear that my hand went numb. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me. She was calm in a way that I found both reassuring and terrifying, the way calm in an emergency is always both of those things at once. I heard the old woman moving around outside, footsteps in the snow along the side of the house, pauses, then more footsteps, and then I heard glass break. It was loud, louder than I expected, a sharp explosive crack, followed by the long crystalline cascade of a whole window giving way, and then silence. I told the dispatcher. She told me the officers were 3 minutes out. Those 3 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat in that bathroom and I listened, and I heard, after a long, terrible pause, the sound of someone moving through the house. Not running, walking, the slow, deliberate creak of someone who was not in a hurry, which was somehow worse than if she'd been rushing. Then I heard her stop outside the bathroom door. I don't know what she said. She was talking, low, continuous, just below the threshold of comprehension. And whatever it was, I couldn't make out words, only the sound of a voice carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. I was pressed against the back wall of that bathroom, sobbing as quietly as I could, phone to my ear, listening to the dispatcher tell me they were almost there, hang on. And then there was a bang at the front door, hard and official. I stood up. I climbed onto the edge of the tub, stretched up, and shoved the bathroom window open. It was one of those small frosted windows up near the ceiling. And I screamed, "Help! In here! Help!" into the night air. 2 officers appeared below the window almost immediately, their flashlights cutting up through the gap. They told me to sit tight. They told me they were going in through the back, through the broken window. They told me I was going to be okay. I heard everything that happened next from inside that bathroom, the thud of someone entering through the broken window. Commands, loud and sharp. "Ma'am, stop! Get on the ground! Get on the ground now!" And then silence. When I came out, she was in handcuffs. She was sitting on the floor of my den, looking at the wall with an expression of perfect blankness, as if whatever switch had been running her had been clicked off. She turned and looked at me when I came through the door, and the look in her eyes, I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. It turned out she lived 4 houses down, in a home she shared with a younger woman who was supposedly her caretaker. The neighbors knew the elderly woman existed but rarely saw her. The caretaker, it was later determined, had been severely negligent, had essentially stopped supervising her altogether. My parents pursued legal action against the caretaker, arguing that as the person responsible for a mentally disabled individual, she bore liability for what had happened. We lost the lawsuit, but the old woman was removed from the neighborhood and placed in a supervised care facility, and I never spent another night alone in that house without double-checking every single lock. The Red Ball, the house, in January. The property had been in my family for almost 20 years. My grandfather bought it in the early 2000s, a small farmhouse on about 11 acres in a rural stretch of upstate New York, the kind of land where you can stand on your porch and see nothing in any direction except fields and tree lines and sky. He used it as a hunting retreat. After he passed, it came to me, and I kept the tradition going. Except instead of hunting, I drove up there in winter to ski at the mountain about 40 minutes north. I went maybe 4 or 5 times each season, always January through March. The house sat empty the rest of the year, sealed up with the water shut off and the heat set to just enough to keep the pipes from freezing. Coming back to it, each visit had a specific feeling I never quite got used to. The particular stillness of a house that has been without people for a long time, the slight staleness in the air, the way sounds seemed louder than they should in empty rooms. There were 2 neighboring properties. To the east, separated from my land by an old cedar fence, was a house I had never been particularly curious about. I'd owned the place for 3 years and never once seen anyone come or go from that property. No cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows, nothing that indicated active habitation. I'd assumed it was a seasonal place like mine, or possibly empty altogether. To the west, farther down the road across the lane, lived a man named Douglas, retired, friendly, one of those neighbors who exists in that ideal zone of being available for conversation without ever imposing on your time. We'd met on my second ever visit to the property, bonded over the fact that we were both heading to the same ski mountain, and had maintained an easy, occasional friendship since. He was the only person I knew up there. I arrived the last weekend of January, pulling in just after dark, the headlights of my truck sweeping over the front of the house and the snow-covered lawn stretching out on either side. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. That's when I heard it. Laughter. A child's laughter, high and clear, coming from the direction of the house to the east. It was brief, just a few seconds, and then the wind picked it up and carried it away, and I was left wondering if I'd imagined it. I hadn't known there were kids on the property next door. Kids change the whole character of a neighborhood, even a rural one. I filed it away as mildly interesting and went inside. The first night was unremarkable. I turned on the water, got the heat running, ate a sandwich I'd brought from home, and went to bed early with the specific exhaustion of 4 hours of winter highway driving. I slept without waking, which was unusual for me in that house. The unfamiliar settling sounds and the rural silence usually kept me in a shallow, restless sleep for the first night or 2. The next morning I woke up clear-headed and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard while the sun came up over the tree line. That's when I noticed it. A red ball, sitting in the snow on the front lawn. About 12 inches across, the kind of solid rubber ball you'd find in a sports supply bin, bright enough that the snow around it seemed to go pale by comparison. It was positioned roughly in the center of the lawn, equidistant from the fence line and the front porch steps. It had not been there the night before. I was certain of that. I'd looked directly at the front lawn when I pulled in. I thought about it for a moment, then went outside, picked it up, and threw it over the cedar fence into the adjacent property. Assumed it belonged to the kids I'd heard the night before, figured they'd retrieve it eventually. I suited up, loaded my gear into the truck, and drove up to the mountain. I spent the day with a few friends from home who'd driven up to meet me. We skied until the lifts closed, then ate dinner together at a restaurant near the lodge. It was dark by the time I made the 40-minute drive back to the house. I was tired and satisfied and thinking about nothing in particular as I walked up the front porch steps. The red ball was sitting in the snow on my front lawn. Same spot. Center of the yard, perfectly positioned as if it had been placed there rather than thrown or rolled. I stood on the porch steps, staring at it for a long moment. Then I picked it up and threw it back over the fence. The laughter in the dark. I was in a deep sleep when the laughter woke me. The clock on the nightstand said 2:47 a.m. The room was dark except for the ambient glow of snow-reflected moonlight coming through the curtains. The laughter was coming from outside. A child, clearly, the same high, musical quality I'd heard on the night I arrived. It wasn't frightened or pained. It was the normal laughter of a kid playing, unself-conscious and continuous. At 2:47 in the morning, I lay still for a moment, listening. It didn't stop. It went on for what must have been 30 seconds, a long time when you're counting it in an otherwise silent room. And then it cut off. I got out of bed and went to the window. The front lawn was empty. No child visible, no movement anywhere. The floodlight above the porch had not triggered, which meant nothing had crossed the sensor. I scanned the fence line, the tree line at the far edge of the property, the road, and then I saw it. The red ball. On the front lawn, same spot. I'd thrown it over that fence twice. I had not crossed the property to retrieve it. I had no explanation. I went outside in my robe and slippers. The snow came up over my ankles immediately, and I walked to the ball and picked it up. I stood there in the middle of the lawn, holding it, the cold settling into my hands through the thin cotton, looking at the fence and the dark windows of the neighboring house beyond it. This time I brought the ball inside. I locked the front door. I set the ball on the kitchen counter where I could see it, and I went back to bed. The laughter did not return that night. The figure in the field. The next morning I went over to the neighboring house. This felt necessary. Not because I had any coherent theory about what was happening, but because I had developed an itch of unease that wasn't going to let me rest until I scratched it. The man who answered the door was not what I expected. He was elderly, mid-70s, I'd guess, with a careful, measured way of moving that suggested years of deliberate living. He was wearing a cardigan and holding a mug of coffee, and he looked at me with the polite, composed expression of someone who is genuinely surprised to have a neighbor but is too well-mannered to show it completely. We introduced ourselves. I told him I owned the property next door, that I came up for the skiing, that I'd meant to introduce myself for a while now. Then I told him about the laughter and the ball. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply that there were no children on his property or anywhere near it. He lived alone. The nearest family with kids was somewhere the other side of the mountain, several miles away. He had not thrown or placed a ball on my lawn. He said all of this with the same composed, careful expression. He didn't look like he was lying. He looked like a man who was also, quietly, unsettled. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I walked back across our shared fence line and stood in my own yard for a moment, breathing cold air, trying to decide what I thought. That day at the mountain was distracted. I went through the motions of skiing with my friends, laughed at the right moments, ate lunch, came back down. But a part of my brain was running a background calculation the whole time, turning the pieces over and finding no configuration that made sense. When I got back to the house that evening, I was exhausted, the deep physical exhaustion of a full day of skiing on top of a disrupted night. And I decided I would pack up everything tonight so I could leave early in the morning without rushing. I dumped my gear on the couch, changed out of my ski clothes, ate leftover soup from a can, and went to bed. I left the red ball on the kitchen counter. At some point, deep in the night, the laughter came back. I was out of bed before I was fully awake, moving to the window on pure instinct. The front lawn was empty. The porch light was on, but the sensor light above it had not triggered. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window and looked left and right along the property line. And then I went to the kitchen to look at the counter. The red ball was gone. I turned on every light in the house. I went from room to room, opening closets, checking behind furniture, checking the deadbolts on every door and the latches on every window. Everything was locked. Nothing was disturbed. There was no sign that anyone had entered. But the ball was gone. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went back to the bedroom, turned on the bedside lamp, and sat on the edge of the bed looking at the wall. My hands were not quite steady. Eventually, I made myself go to the window one more time. The red ball was sitting in the snow on the front lawn, and standing behind it, maybe 30 yards away at the far edge of the floodlit area where the yard began to dissolve into darkness, was a child. Small, still wearing dark clothing, standing with a posture that was completely motionless, completely upright, looking at my window. I let go of the curtain and stepped back from the glass. My heart was going at a pace that made thinking difficult. I reached out and pulled the curtain all the way across the rod, and then backed away from the window and sat down on the floor with my back against the bed. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for my pulse to come down. Long enough for exhaustion to start winning over fear. I slept eventually. Fitfully, with the lamp on, waking twice to silence, and once to what might have been laughter very far away. In the morning, I left without eating breakfast. I loaded the truck in the dark, locked the house, and drove away without looking at the front lawn. But I knew the ball was there. I've never taken anything from that house that I didn't mean to take, and I've never lost anything I didn't put down somewhere myself. So when I tell you I have no explanation for how that ball moved, I mean it precisely. I have no explanation. All the doors were locked. All the windows were latched. I checked each one myself. The child standing in the dark is the image that stays with me longest. Not the ball, not the laughter. The stillness of a small figure in the snow at 3 in the morning watching a house. I haven't been back in the winter since. The man next door, the neighbor, we never saw. Marcus and I had been living together for close to 2 years before the house next door changed hands. We'd met at the logistics company where we both worked, bonded over the commute and an equal dedication to leaving the office at exactly 5 p.m., and eventually realized we'd save a significant amount of money if we pooled our rent. The arrangement worked perfectly. We were compatible roommates, functional friends, and the house was exactly 15 minutes from the office by car, which made the carpooling easy. The house sat in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, the kind of street where most of the residents had been there for years and knew each other's cars and general routines. When the house next door had been empty for a few months, neither Marcus nor I gave it much thought. When it finally sold, we noticed the change the way you notice most things on a familiar street, a beat later than it actually happens. We became aware of the new neighbor not through any introduction or the usual visible activity of someone moving in, but through small absences and negatives. The moving truck we never saw. The boxes being carried inside that we never caught, the face we never managed to glimpse. His car appeared in the driveway, a dark SUV with tinted windows, and that was the first concrete evidence we had that someone was actually living there. On the 3rd day after the car appeared, Marcus and I walked over together and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. But the car was in the driveway. We could hear movement inside, the faint, muffled quality of a television or maybe voices carried through the door and walls. Someone was home and choosing not to answer. We shrugged at each other, agreed he was probably just busy, and turned to walk back down the front path. Marcus made it about 3 steps before he stopped and put his hand on my arm. "Don't turn around fast," he said quietly. "Look at the window next to the door." I turned slowly. The window beside the front door had horizontal blinds, and in the middle of them, one slat had been lifted with a single finger. A face was behind it, male, middle-aged, broad, watching us through the gap. Not with curiosity, not with the slightly embarrassed expression of someone who just didn't feel like answering the door, with a focused, still intensity that had no social grace in it at all. Marcus and I kept walking. When we got back inside our house, we agreed, without needing to say much, that this was not a man who was going to be waving over the fence. That night, around 1 in the morning, I was still awake. I've always been a late sleeper, when I heard sounds coming from outside. My bedroom window overlooks the side of the neighboring yard, and that's where the sounds were coming from. I went to the window and looked out. The neighbor was in his backyard. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, and he was working a handsaw through what appeared to be a large section of lumber, moving with the steady, mechanical rhythm of someone who does this regularly and doesn't think about it. The temperature that night was in the low 70s. Nobody saws lumber in a hood in 70-degree weather. I knocked on Marcus's door. He was already awake. The sound had woken him, too. He had work at 7. What the neighbor was doing wasn't just strange, it was actively disruptive, and it showed no sign of stopping. We agreed to go over and ask him politely to stop for the night. We went out through our back door and knocked on the gate that separated our yards. The sawing stopped immediately, not slowing down or tapering off, but cutting off cleanly, the way a machine stops when you flip a switch. We waited for the gate to open. It didn't. We stood there for a moment, looking at each other. The yard on the other side of the gate was completely quiet. Then we heard him go back inside through his back door. We went back to bed. The sawing didn't start again. We told ourselves it was over. What we heard. 3 nights later, I was jerked out of sleep by a sound that my brain took several confused seconds to identify. Screaming. Female. Coming from next door. The sound wasn't continuous. It was the kind of screaming that happens in bursts, like someone trying to get as much noise out as possible before something cuts it off, then trying again. I was at my window in seconds. The neighbor was in his backyard. He was moving fast, heading toward the back door of his house, and he was dragging something heavy and dark that left a furrow in the wet grass behind him. I couldn't make out what it was. Then he stopped. He looked up, directly at my window. We locked eyes for less than 2 seconds. Then I stepped back from the glass. I ran to Marcus's room. He was already awake, already on his phone, already dialing. He was talking to the dispatcher before I got the door fully open. I stood in the hallway while he reported the screaming, the figure in the yard, the thing being dragged. Then we heard the back door of our own house open. Marcus was still on the phone. I watched his face change. He told the dispatcher to send help immediately, that the man had just entered our house, and he stayed on the line while I went to the hall and stood at the top of the stairs listening. The floorboards in the kitchen were creaking. Slow, deliberate, not the random sounds of a house settling. Footsteps, the weight shift of someone moving carefully in a space they don't know. I went back to Marcus's room and shut the door. There was no lock on it. We positioned ourselves against it, our combined weight pressed into the wood, Marcus still on the phone, me with my shoulder into the door panel listening to every sound in the hallway. The footsteps came up the stairs. Fast. There was no more pretense of quiet now. He was moving with purpose, and when he hit the hallway he went straight for the bathroom door, which opened. The bathroom was empty. And then he came to Marcus's door. He hit it hard. Not knocking, throwing his shoulder into it once, twice, and then something solid and heavy against the wood. Something that wasn't his fist. We threw ourselves against the door and held. Marcus was telling the dispatcher on the phone to get officers inside through the back right now, through the back door right now. His voice was even. I don't know how his voice was even. The man hit the door again and again. He did not get through. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His footsteps went back down the stairs. The house went quiet. We held our position for almost 2 minutes, not speaking, not moving. Then Marcus lowered his phone and looked at me. From downstairs, a voice. "Police! Open up!" It was a man's voice, authoritative, deep. We both felt the same wave of relief at exactly the same moment. I could see it in Marcus's face. And without discussing it, we opened the door and started down the stairs. The living room was empty, no officers, no flashing lights through the front window. "That wasn't them," Marcus said. He said it very quietly, and I already knew. I saw him first. He was crouched behind the dining room table, barely visible in the dark, watching us come down the stairs. He had used the voice as a lure, had somehow mimicked exactly the tone and cadence of a police announcement, and now he was between us and the front door. "Back up," Marcus said, and we both turned and ran back up the stairs before the man got fully to his feet. We had one option left, the bathroom, which had an actual lock on the door. We got inside and threw the bolt. For a few seconds the hallway was silent. Then we heard it downstairs, the real thing. Multiple voices, lower and more distributed, spreading through the first floor. And then, "Police! Show me your hands! Do not move!" The man in the hallway stopped. We heard something small and metallic hit the floor. A knife, we found out later, serrated, 8 inches. And then the sounds of struggle, of a man being physically restrained, of officers calling to each other. Marcus and I were screaming from inside the bathroom that we were up here, that we were in the bathroom. And the responding officers came up the stairs and told us it was clear, and we opened the door and came out. The man was in handcuffs on our front porch. The officers were already calling for backup. Marcus and I stood in the doorway of our own house, watching more patrol cars come up the street. What they found. We told the officers about the screaming. We told them about the figure in the backyard and the thing being dragged. They exchanged a look, the kind that professionals exchange when they have already suspected something and have just received confirmation. And 2 of them went next door with weapons drawn. They were inside for a long time. When they came out, there were 2 additional patrol cars on the street, and then an ambulance and then a vehicle that I later identified as a county medical examiner's van. A woman came out first, supported by 2 officers wrapped in a blanket. She was crying with the total, full-body exhaustion of someone who has been crying for a very long time. She had been in the basement. She had been locked in the basement, and she had been pressing herself against the door and screaming as loud as her body would allow her to scream over and over, hoping that someone in the adjacent houses would hear. We had heard her. There was a body. I won't describe what the officers told us about it because some details are not mine to share, and some I simply prefer not to carry in language. The man was taken away in a patrol car. The woman was taken away in the ambulance. The block stayed lit with emergency lights until well past 4 in the morning, and Marcus and I sat on our front steps watching it all unfold, not talking much. The house next door was processed over the following days. The "For Rent" sign went back up within a month. The property management company did their turnover, and the neighbors on the block started watching the driveway again, waiting to see who would come next. Marcus and I stayed. We'd talked briefly about moving, about whether we could really come home every night to a house next to where that had happened, but we decided to stay. The neighborhood was otherwise good. The commute was 15 minutes. And honestly, the worst that could happen, we now knew, we had already lived through. We just started locking the back door. These accounts are based on real experiences as shared by the individuals involved. Details have been adapted for narrative clarity. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, please contact your local emergency services or the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Sleep tight.